Welcome to Mosaic. I'm your host, Susan Schulman-Pertnoy. Mosaic is Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's weekly news magazine, exploring the most critical issues facing Jews here and around the world. The Iran nuclear threat, military strikes in Syria, rocket fire from Gaza, the U.S. administration's efforts for peace. We're bringing you an insider's update from 3 renowned experts. We'll be right back with Mosaic.
You are the book that lights the spark and the hand that passes the torch, the fuel that powers the change that betters the world, across town, across oceans, the hand that soothes the spirit that survived the unthinkable. You are there in the darkest of times to strengthen our community.
Good Greek moving and storage. Your superhero movers.
Or moving horror story.
Hey, I heard you're looking for a mover. I got a deal for you.
Staring at his mover out there!
As a former police officer, I've heard all of the moving horror stories. But you can trust me and my pros, and we'll have you saying,
Opa!
Call Star Greek.
Good Greek moving and storage. Your superhero movers.
The Levin Palace at Morse Life is leasing luxury residences for ages 65 plus. Offering more than first-class amenities and white glove service, life at the Palace is like life aboard a luxury cruise ship with more things to enjoy life now. More fabulous food, more fun, more friends, more family, more freedom, more future. Morse Life is more life. Live it at the Palace. Start your fabulous future now. Call 561-537-3402.
We're here with Dr. Sarah Foyer, who is a national security expert in the Middle East and a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome to Mosaic, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
You live and work in Israel. What's the political temperature right now?
I think of it in the metaphor of a boxing match, maybe. So the last few months, the players retreated to their corners for a bit, and I think a lot of people were hoping that they would make nice and be able to find some path to a governing coalition. And so things were relatively calm as the negotiations were going on for that. Now, with new elections scheduled, it's a little bit like they're returning to the center of the ring for what might turn into a more heated match as we head into the election campaign period.
So how do you think a new government will look vis-a-vis the Arab situation?
So I think there are 3 possibilities here. One is that we actually have a deadlock again, that a new election, because of the electoral math, will make it very difficult for the parties that gain the most seats to cobble together a governing coalition. And then we really are going to be in uncharted territories. There's another possibility that we have a new, more right-wing government, in which case I think that you might start to see moves toward, for example, annexation of parts of the West Bank. And I think that could trigger some very serious reactions on the part of Israel's Arab neighbors and also Europe.
I would think so.
Yeah. Now, if we have a government that is more centrist, center-left, I think in many respects you're not going to see a huge change in terms of Israel's policies, for example, dealing with Iran's entrenchment in the north, or even Israel's outreach to what we usually call the Sunni pragmatic states or the Sunni moderate states, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and all the rest. But I think you could see a significant change on the Palestinian front. I think a center-left government would be more inclined to want to try and retain the possibility of ultimately separating from the Palestinians. And so you would see a shift in the approach to dealing with that whole conflict.
How do Israelis see current developments in the Middle East? And what do they think about U.S. policies therein?
So I think Israelis are deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program. I think they are very worried about Iran's more aggressive posture in the region and its involvement in places like Iraq and now Syria and Lebanon. These are, of course, right in Israel's neighborhood. I think there's also a general kind of wariness about all of the upheaval sweeping the Arab world lately. We've seen in 2019 really an uptick in protests across the region, and I think Israelis are sort of sitting back and waiting to see how is this all going to shake out. And I think that has been coupled with an eagerness to try and improve Israel's relations with states in the Gulf that seem to be indicating more of a willingness to step by step move towards something resembling a normalization. Now, in terms of how Israelis see U.S. policy, I think on the one hand there's a deep acknowledgement and a recognition and an appreciation for policies of the Trump administration, which have been broadly sympathetic to Israel, whether that was in the form of recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israeli sovereignty on the Golan. So there is a deep appreciation for what the Trump administration has done. But I think on the other hand, there is a kind of nagging question and a concern about America's apparent intention to retreat from the Middle East more generally. So the pullout from Syria, this is very worrisome to Israelis to the extent that it will leave room for Iran and other nefarious actors to gain a greater foothold. So it's a mixed picture.
How do you assess this administration's efforts to bring Israel together with other Arab states such as Saudi Arabia?
So I think here too, I would say it's a kind of mixed scorecard. I mean, on the one hand, we have seen real progress, both in the covert and the overt. So covertly, it's widely presumed that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel have stepped up their security cooperation because, of course, they all share a concern about Iran's aggression. But you've also seen more overt statements of support. You had the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Oman. This was a very open and in public. The foreign minister of Bahrain was on record as saying that Israel belongs in the neighborhood. You had the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia saying that Israel has a right to its own, the Jews have a right to their own homeland in the region. So there have been real kind of outward indications of progress.
What about
on the
obstacles?
other hand, right, on the other hand, we have seen real obstacles. I mean, you still don't have anything resembling a formal normalization with these countries. The economic conference that the Trump administration hosted this past summer to try and get Arab states to invest in the Palestinian territories and to sign on to a broader deal, the so-called deal of the century, didn't really yield much. And so I think it's a mixed bag, and we'll have to see whether some of this ends up being kind of more hype than what actually happens on the ground.
What do you recommend that Washington do to promote moderation in lieu of extremism in the region?
So I think there are a few things that we could be doing. One is we need to be sure to be strengthening our allies in the region. For example, Jordan comes to mind. Jordan is a very important ally of the United States, not just because of its upholding its treaty with Israel, but because it has really been a force for moderation in the region. And so we need to make sure that we're supporting allies such as Jordan. I think in parallel, we need to look at, for example, developments coming out of Saudi Arabia, of all places. In the last couple of years, the Crown Prince and the head of the Muslim World League, which has been a major vehicle of Saudi religious export, some of which was responsible for spreading this extremism, they have now been going around saying that they would like to fundamentally reform the religious discourse that's coming out of Saudi Arabia. And so there are indications of a real willingness to start to change decades of very problematic policy. And so I think Washington needs to meet them where they have said they want to be and say, we're going to partner with you and make sure that you are able to follow through on implementing really your own stated reform agenda. This is not so much about us going in and sort of waving our fingers at the Saudis and telling them what we think they should do. They've given us an opening. They have said, we want to reform. And so we should be sure that we are lending them support. It can be quietly, but we need to be there with them in this very important process.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back after this brief message. Coming up, is there new hope for Israel and its Arab neighbors?
What's the best kept secret in new cars? It's that you can get a brand new Mini at Braman Mini Palm Beach for under $21,000, which includes free maintenance for 3 years. No kidding. Plus, free membership to the fun Mini Club of South Florida for road trips and autocross, and even more with club room social events. Mini is more than just driving. It's about having fun with the Braman Mini community. Learn about Braman Mini at BramanMini.com. Minis for under $21,000, free maintenance, Mini Club, and Club Braman benefits. It's a no-brainer. Braman Mini is the right choice.
Eat, drink, and enjoy Shabbat services at Temple Bethel's Friday night happenings. Cocktail reception and kosher dinner at 5:30, followed by our creative, musically driven Shabbat service. Traditional to progressive, the food and music change every Friday, and you'll want to stay for complimentary dessert.
Plan to spend the whole evening here, and you'll walk away and you'll say, wow, we're coming back next week. Welcome at Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat services at Temple Bethel, open to everyone. Join us every Friday night.
Good Greek, moving and storage. Your superhero movers.
More moving horror stories. Think it's a good idea for your friends to show up with pizza and beer to help you move? Wrong. Amateurs.
Is there a real mover out there?
As a former police officer, I've heard all of the moving horror stories. But you can trust me and my pros, and we'll have you saying,
Opa!
Call Star Greek.
Good Greek, moving and storage. Your superhero movers.
We're now joined by Ambassador Barbara Leaf, who was the former ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, and now she's currently a fellow with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome to Mosaic, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for having me.
I've read that you were such a beloved figure in that country. What made you connect with the people there?
So I don't think I did anything truly magical or out of the box, as it were, but what I did do was focus on the things and the activities, the events, the issues that are really important to Emiratis. So in addition to doing some volunteer work that I led...
Like you cleaned the ocean?
Oh, we cleaned a few beaches, that's right.
Yes, it's unusual.
Well, no, but it was a lot of fun. It was something that a lot of our embassy personnel and consulate general personnel were very passionate about. But they recognize that Emiratis are increasingly sensitive to the costs to them of despoiling of beaches. They sit right on the Gulf, and of course all that waste, the plastic and so forth, just comes up on their lovely beaches. So we cleaned up a wildlife refuge, and we helped release turtles into the sea. We helped replant black mangroves, which are terrific for carbon reduction. But as importantly, I really threw myself into what I would call heritage events. So events throughout the year that Emiratis use to celebrate their own heritage, either as seafarers or Bedouins, because their society is a mix of these traditions. I went to camel races, I went to camel beauty contests.
Oh my goodness.
I went to all sorts of events that took me out to the desert, and I made sure to put them on social media. And I took my family, they loved it, and Emiratis just were electrified by the fact that I was, as the ambassador, as this figure that has a certain status in their country, was going the extra mile to dive into their culture, and that helped me connect with them and them with me.
I know they really appreciated you doing that. What was the focus of your work as ambassador there?
So look, the relationship with the UAE is really quite an important one and has been for some years. It was historically largely a defense and security relationship, but over time it's been built out into a very important trade and commercial relationship, but also counterterrorism, counter proliferation. So I did things across the spectrum of issues, but I really did focus, because of the turmoil in the region, I focused on collaborative approaches to some of the conflicts in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, deepened, expanded the defense and the counterterrorism relationship, because those are good for both of us.
Right.
And I had lots of fun on the cultural side as well.
Shifting gears,
Yes.
we've heard a lot in recent years about the threat of a nuclear Iran
Yes.
vis-a-vis Israel.
Yes.
Has the nuclear agreement actually helped to calm some of that angst?
So I think, first of all, you're correct that a nuclear Iran would be a deep threat to Israel. It's also a deep threat to us in the United States and to the region and so on. I think there were a lot of shortcomings to the nuclear agreement that was signed in 2015, but I personally thought the better part of valor would have been to stick with it, going into the next administration, enlarge, expand, and take the agreement into some areas that hadn't been touched, such as regional destabilizing activities and, of course, ballistic missiles.
Is the U.S. in a better position now that we've pulled out of the agreement?
I personally don't think so, because what we're in now is this sort of funny gray zone. Gray zone is a term that is often used by defense experts to talk about the way Iran conducts its own aggressive activities. It's not conventional war, but it's something just short of conventional war. And in a sense, politically and diplomatically, we're in that gray zone. The administration has put all of its money, if you will, on the maximum pressure campaign, which is economic pressure. It's having an effect, no question. But is it enough to take Iran to a negotiating table? It's not.
Well, it creates tremendous amount of tensions between Iran and the U.S. How is that working?
So what we've also seen is that Iran has essentially said to all of our Gulf partners, hey, if we can't export oil, we're going to make trouble for you. And by the way, we're going to affect your security. We're not going to be the only ones affected by this pressure campaign of the Americans. And I think that's what we saw over the summer in terms of these attacks on shipping, and then of course most dramatically the attack on Saudi oil facilities in September.
You've worked in Arab nations in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
What would you advise that Israel do to help foster better relations with its neighbors?
So I think there's no escaping the centrality of the Palestinian issue for a lot of the publics in the Middle East, and for to some degree or another, the governments in the Middle East. That said, we can already see that there is a level of informal, not really ad hoc, it's more than ad hoc, cooperation on security matters, and very limited. We have a limited visibility on some of this, but we have more clearer visibility in terms of the signaling that some of the Gulf countries have done towards Israel and having ministers come to sports events and things of that nature. But I think there's a certain natural limit, and so as long as there's not any kind of viable process underway between the Palestinians and Israelis, that's going to put a brake on the willingness of these governments to move forward in a more formal fashion.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back after this brief message. Coming up, how recent military action in Syria may determine the future of peace for Israel.
You are the book that lights the spark and the hand that passes the torch, the fuel that powers the change that betters the world, across town, across oceans, the hand that soothes the spirit that survived the unthinkable. You are there in the darkest of times to strengthen our community.
Morse Life Memory Care is making a difference in the lives of our residents with innovative programs that offer them a more rewarding future. Our goal is to give our residents more time. Time for programs that help cognition, for favorite foods in our open kitchen any time of day, for fun with new friends, and time for family, free from care and worry. most importantly, for the compassion and dignity they deserve.
What's the best kept secret in new cars? It's that you can get a brand new Mini at Bremen Mini Palm Beach for under $21,000, which includes free maintenance for 3 years. No kidding.
Plus, free membership to the fun Mini Club of South Florida for road trips and autocross, and even more with Club Room social events. Mini is more than just driving. It's about having fun with the Bremen Mini community. Learn about Bremen Mini at BremenMini.com. Minis for under $21,000, free maintenance, Mini Club, and Club Bremen benefits. It's a no-brainer. Bremen Mini is the right choice.
We're back with Dana Stroll. Dana was most recently working with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is also a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome, Dana, to Mosaic.
Thank you so much for having me.
President Trump has announced the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria 3 times this year. What is our military doing?
This is a great question, and one that a lot of Americans and actually most of our allies and partners around the world are asking as well. So essentially, U.S. forces in Syria are doing the same thing they've been doing for the last couple years. They are supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces. Many of you have heard a lot about this. The large component is the Syrian Kurds, who are fighting ISIS so that our young men and women don't have to directly fight ISIS themselves. So our forces are in Syria providing intelligence support, some weapons, some training, and some guidance to others, local partners, local Arabs, local Syrian Kurds, who are directly fighting ISIS.
You co-led a study group that argued against the withdrawal of the troops from Syria. Tell us why that's more important.
So the Syria Study Group was a group directed by Congress, comprised of 6 members of the group appointed by Democratic members of Congress, 6 appointed by Republican members of Congress, but all outside experts, so not members of Congress ourselves. And we were directed to provide our assessment of both the political and military state of play in Syria, and also make recommendations for U.S. policy going forward. To do that work, we had really broad consultations across the U.S. government, foreign governments, United Nations, local groups here in the United States, and we also traveled on fact-finding missions across the Middle East. And what the core of our recommendation was the U.S. military presence in northeast Syria is absolutely critical, not just because our military is the backbone to support Syrians in fighting ISIS, which is the top U.S. national interest in Syria, making sure that ISIS cannot reconstitute and use Syria as a base to attack the United States or our allies and partners, but also because the territory that the United States sits on via our local partners is the 1/3 of Syria that is the economic powerhouse of the entire country. It's where the agriculture is, it's where the oil is, which President Trump has talked about often. Right. But the importance of that 1/3 of Syria is that Assad, the dictator who currently is in Damascus, as well as Russia and Iran, who are backing Assad, they want that 1/3 of Syria. It's enormous leverage for the United States in moving forward a political process and getting all of the actors to make concessions that are in the United States' interest to move a political process forward. And that political process is important because we need to be able to address the underlying causes of the Syria conflict.
We haven't heard a lot lately about ISIS. With the death of Baghdadi, did that weaken the movement?
No, and in fact, there was a really interesting report that came out from the Inspector General of the entire U.S. military operation to defeat ISIS. So the named mission for U.S. forces fighting ISIS is called Operation Inherent Resolve, and they're working in both Iraq and Syria on the military effort through local partners to fight ISIS. And the Inspector General comes out with quarterly reports updating Congress and the public, so these are publicly available reports about the state of ISIS. And that report specifically said that the elimination of Baghdadi has no impact on ISIS, the organization. They still have funding, they have resources, their leadership and command and control will be able to replace Baghdadi pretty quickly. They have the motivation to continue attacking, and even though they don't own territory in Syria or Iraq, they've moved into a counterinsurgency force, and it still is very much a threat to the United States.
So how can the United States maintain pressure on ISIS?
By continuing to support local partners who demonstrate the will and the motivation and have the skills to fight ISIS, which is why you've seen, despite the president's announcements of U.S. forces withdrawing, that he's still keeping some forces there. Without U.S. military forces providing that platform and motivation to local partners to fight ISIS, the United States is probably just going to have to return to the Middle East again and again to face these counterterrorism challenges.
What makes Syria such a threat to Israel?
So Syria is really a crucible of the most pressing threats facing the United States as well as Israel: counterterrorism and Russia. And Russia backed Bashar al-Assad in 2015 with a big military intervention, but has used that little toehold in Syria to really strategically maneuver across the Middle East. Russia and Iran are working hand in hand to make sure that Bashar al-Assad stays in power in Damascus. And Bashar al-Assad has an extremely long history of working with terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and like ISIS. So, because of all of these mix of really bad actors in Syria, Iran has been able to move closer and closer to Israel's borders. They're getting enormous practice, weapons training, maneuvers, as has Lebanese Hezbollah, and they are using Syria as a staging ground to both threaten Israel and move more and more sophisticated weapons closer to Israel's borders.
There's a foreign policy debate in the United States about ending the so-called forever wars. What do you think about that?
What is very interesting about this political moment in the United States is that you have many of the Democratic primary candidates and people like the President, Donald Trump, talking about ending forever wars. I think what this misses is that different U.S. military engagements across the world are all for different reasons, and some of them, in fact, most of them, are not active conflict. So a lot of times we have forces, for example, stationed in most of the Gulf countries in the Middle East. It is from those bases that we are able to do our military operations against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. We also have those forces as a form of deterrence to warn the Iranians not to mess with the United States and not to challenge our partners and allies in the Middle East. We have military doing exercises so that if there is a conflict, our forces and our partner forces have experience working together. We sell weapons, we do training on weapons. So I think that if you just talk about forever wars or endless wars, you're missing a lot of the nuance and details that many of these military engagements actually serve the United States, not just in the short term, but in the long term.
It's so frightening.
It's extremely frightening.
Dana, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Mosaic is brought to you by these generous sponsors and underwriters. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpalmbeach.org/mosaic.